If you've ever waited at a railroad crossing and counted the cars rolling past, you've probably noticed something ODD. Somewhere in the middle of the train, tucked between loaded coal hoppers or tanker cars, sits a full-size diesel locomotive. No crew in the cab, no cars trailing behind it like a second train. But that engine isn't lost. It isn't being shipped to another yard. So why would a railroad deliberately put a locomotive in the middle of a freight train instead of up front where it belongs? The answer goes back to a physics problem that nearly every railroad in the world had to solve, and a piece of technology born in a small telephone factory in rural Ohio that changed freight railroading forever. The simplest way to move a freight train is to line up your locomotives at the head end and pull. For more than a century, from the first steam-powered runs on wooden-railed track to the big diesel road engines of the 1950s, that approach worked well enough. Early locomotives hauled trains of 50 or 60 cars over most terrain without much trouble. The lead engine pulled, the freight cars followed, and the steel couplers between them held the whole consist together. But by the mid-20th century, American railroads wanted longer trains. Longer trains meant fewer crews, fewer terminal stops, and lower operating costs per ton of freight hauled across the continent. The economics were obvious. The physics, however, were not so cooperative. When all the pulling force comes from the front of a train, every coupler between the lead locomotive and the last car carries the accumulated weight of everything behind it. On a short train of 30 cars, that load stays well within the coupler's design limits. But on a train stretching over a mile with 100 loaded coal hoppers grinding up a mountain grade, the drawbar force on the couplers nearest the locomotive can exceed what the steel hardware was built to handle. That's when knuckles snap and trains come apart on the main line. And the problems didn't stop at coupler stress. When a long, heavy freight train rounded a curve under full throttle, those enormous pulling forces tried to straighten the train into a line, the same way pulling a chain taut across a tabletop drags the middle links toward the straight path. Railroaders called this string lining, and on mountain subdivisions with tight curves and heavy tonnage, it could drag the inner wheels of lighter cars right off the inside rail. One moment the train is rounding a bend through a river valley. The next, empty gondola cars are tumbling down the embankment. But perhaps the most dangerous problem was braking. Freight trains rely on air brakes, a system invented by George Westinghouse back in 1868. It works by sending changes in air pressure through a continuous brake pipe running the entire length of the train. The engineer controls everything from the locomotive at the front. On a short train of 40 cars, the brake response is almost immediate. But on a train with 150 cars stretching nearly 2 miles, it can take a full minute, sometimes closer to 2 minutes, for a brake command to propagate all the way to the last car. What does that mean in practice? The front of the train is already slowing down while the rear is still barreling forward at full speed. The cars in between slam together like an accordion, building enormous compressive forces that can buckle cars on curves or snap coupler knuckles apart entirely. Railroaders call this slack action, and it's been responsible for derailments, broken equipment, and spilled cargo for as long as trains have existed. Cold weather made everything worse. The rubber hose connections between cars leaked more readily in freezing temperatures, and the air compressors on the front locomotive struggled to maintain adequate pressure across a brake pipe running through 150 leaking joints. A train that stopped reliably in September could become dangerously sluggish by January. So how did the railroads deal with all of this before modern technology stepped in? For decades, railroads addressed these problems with the only tool available to them on mountain subdivisions. They stationed extra locomotives at the base of steep grades, staffed by their own engineers and firemen, ready to couple onto the rear of heavy freight trains and push them over the mountain. These were called helper locomotives, and they were a fixture of mountain railroading across the Appalachians, the Rockies, and the Sierra Nevada range. If you've ever seen old photographs of steam-era helper districts, with thick black smoke billowing from both ends of a coal train clawing its way up a 2% grade through the Blue Ridge Mountains, You know what this operation looked like. On the steepest grades in the Cascade Range and the Alleghenies, helper engines waited in sidings at the bottom of the hill, their boilers kept hot around the clock, ready to couple up and shove the next loaded freight train over the summit. But the helper system was expensive in ways that compounded with every freight run over the mountain. Every helper district required its own fleet of locomotives, its own crew roster, its own roundhouse or engine servicing facility, and its own dispatcher coordination. The helper crew had to ride back down the mountain after the push, either running light on the helper engine itself or catching a ride on a following freight. Delays stacked up at the base of every grade, labor costs multiplied with every shift change, and railroad management knew there had to be a better solution somewhere on the horizon. What happened next came from an unlikely source. In the early 1960s, a man named D.W. Brosnan was leading the Southern Railway out of its Washington, D.C. headquarters. Brosnan was not the kind of railroad president who spent his days behind a mahogany desk. He had joined the Southern in 1926 as an apprentice laying track in the Georgia heat, and over the next 4 decades, he worked his way up through every operational department the railroad had. By the time he became president in 1962, he had earned a reputation as a relentless modernizer with what one colleague described as a strange mixture of genius and ruthlessness. Brosnan had a concept that would reshape freight railroading. What if you could control a locomotive positioned in the middle or rear of a freight train by radio signal, without a crew aboard? The lead engineer could manage the remote engine from the cab of the front locomotive, coordinating throttle commands and brake applications across the entire train, as if all the power were concentrated in one place. He turned to the North Electric Company, a small telephone and electronics manufacturer based in Galion, Ohio. North Electric had experience building remote control systems for oil pipelines and electric utilities using a technology called SCADA. Adapting that radio control capability for a diesel locomotive rolling through the Appalachian Mountains was a significant leap, but it was exactly the kind of leap Brosnan demanded. The first test of the system took place on the Southern Railway main line in 1963. Early equipment was bulky, to say the least. Radio receivers and control electronics were far too large to fit inside a standard locomotive cab, so North Electric mounted them in a separate ballasted boxcar that traveled coupled to the remote engine. That boxcar connected to the locomotive through standard multiple unit cables, while its radio antenna linked it to the lead unit at the head of the train. It worked. The lead engineer could throttle up the remote diesel locomotive, apply its dynamic brakes, and synchronize its air brake commands with the front consist, all through a radio signal bouncing between antennas half a mile apart. By 1965, the first production systems were installed on Southern Railway freight trains. The technology eventually received a trade name that would become synonymous with distributed power across the global railroad industry. They called it Locotrol. But here's the detail that often gets overlooked about how distributed power spread across the world's railroads. The early adopters were not random. They read like a roster of the railroads hauling the heaviest, most punishing freight on Earth. The Norfolk and Western Railway with its Appalachian coal drags, Canadian Pacific grinding through the Canadian Rockies, and halfway around the world, the iron ore railroads of Queensland and Mount Newman in Australia, where trains already stretched past 2 miles. Each faced the same fundamental physics problem, and each saw the same answer in Brosnan's concept. Within 2 decades of that first test on the Southern, Locotrol equipment was operating on 4 continents. If you are finding this useful, consider subscribing. We cover railroad engineering and history every week. Over the decades that followed, the electronics shrank dramatically. What once required a dedicated boxcar eventually fit into a compact cabinet bolted inside the locomotive cab itself. The radio systems grew more sophisticated, incorporating fail-safe protocols that automatically applied the train brakes if communication between the lead and remote units was ever interrupted. Software replaced much of the manual coordination, giving the engineer a digital display showing throttle position, brake status, and telemetry data from every remote unit in real time. What did all of this actually change for the trains running through mountain territory and across open plains? The benefits reached far beyond raw pulling force. By distributing locomotive power throughout the length of a freight train, railroads cut the maximum drawbar stress on any single coupler by roughly half. Trains that would have torn themselves apart with all power concentrated at the head end could now run safely with locomotives spaced at strategic intervals. String lining derailments on mountain curves dropped sharply because the pulling force was no longer concentrated at one end of the consist. And jackknifing, the opposite danger where compressed freight cars on a curve get shoved off the high rail, became far easier to manage when braking forces were spread evenly. Braking itself improved more than almost anything else. With a remote locomotive in the middle or rear of the train running its own air compressor, brake pipe pressure stayed consistent throughout the consist, even in bitter cold weather. And because the remote unit could apply its brakes almost simultaneously with the lead locomotive through the radio link, rather than waiting for the air pressure signal to crawl through the brake pipe car by car, the dangerous slack action that plagued long trains was reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Fuel consumption dropped measurably too. Field studies showed that distributed power configurations saved roughly 4 to 6% in diesel fuel compared to the same gross tonnage pulled entirely from the front. On a Class 1 railroad burning billions of gallons of diesel per year, those single-digit percentages translate into savings measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. Lower in train forces also meant less wear on locomotive wheels, rail surfaces, and coupler components, stretching maintenance intervals and reducing the long-term cost of track infrastructure. But the real proof of what distributed power could achieve was not measured in fuel receipts or locomotive maintenance logs. It was measured in sheer tonnage and track miles. On June 21, 2001, in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, BHP Iron Ore assembled a train that stretched 7.353 kilometers, roughly 4.5 miles, from the nose of the first locomotive to the rear coupler of the last loaded ore wagon. That consist included 682 iron ore cars and 8 GE AC6000CW diesel-electric locomotives arranged in a distributed configuration spread throughout the train's length. Total payload was approximately 82,000 metric tons of iron ore, with the gross weight of the entire train, rolling stock included, approaching 100,000 tons. This massive train departed from the Yandi mine and traveled 275 kilometers southeast to the port at Port Hedland, a journey that took roughly 10 hours. At railroad crossings along the route, it took 6 full minutes to rumble past. That day, BHP set the Guinness World Record for the longest and heaviest freight train ever operated on any railroad, anywhere in the world. Could 8 locomotives have done that job from the front? Not a chance. The coupler forces behind a consist of 682 loaded ore wagons would have exceeded every structural limit in the drawbar assembly before the train cleared the first grade change. Spread across the length of the train, though, those same 8 locomotives worked in coordinated radio-linked harmony, each one sharing the load, each one maintaining brake pipe pressure in its section, each one answering commands from the single engineer riding in the lead cab hundreds of cars ahead. Today, distributed power isn't experimental. It's standard practice on virtually every major freight railroad in North America. BNSF and Union Pacific run DPU equipped trains daily across the Powder River Basin coal fields, through the Feather River Canyon, and over the Continental Divide at elevations where the air itself works against diesel engine performance. CSX has deployed distributed power on routes as short as 34 miles in the eastern United States to boost coal train capacity by 30%. Globally, railroads in South Africa, Brazil, China, and India all run heavy haul operations built around the same distributed power concept that started on the Southern Railway 6 decades earlier, and the technology hasn't stopped evolving. Modern engineer assist systems have taken it even further. Wabtec's Trip Optimizer and New York Air Brake's Leader software manage throttle, dynamic brake, and air brake applications automatically based on gradient, train weight, and the terrain profile ahead. These computerized systems coordinate distributed power units with a precision no human engineer could match alone. optimizing fuel burn and minimizing entrained forces mile by mile in real time. A single engineer sitting in the lead cab of a 2-mile-long coal train now has more control over the forces acting on every coupler in that consist than an entire team of railroaders had 50 years ago. But what does all of this mean for the freight train rolling through your town? The trains keep getting longer, consists of 150 cars, and more are routine now on Western Class I railroads. The crews haven't grown, and the locomotive buried in the middle of the consist, the one that looks like a mistake to anyone who hasn't studied the engineering, keeps doing the quiet, invisible work that holds the entire operation together. 60 years ago, controlling a locomotive by radio from a mile away was an experiment on a single railroad. It started as an idea from a Southern Railway president who had begun his career laying track in the Georgia sun, built by a telephone company in a small Ohio factory town, and tested on an Appalachian main line in 1963. Today, more than 20,000 locomotives worldwide carry the distributed power equipment that makes it all possible. But who could have predicted that a concept born from pipeline remote control technology in rural Ohio would end up reshaping how freight moves across 6 continents? What started as a way to avoid hiring extra crews for mountain helper districts has become the backbone of modern freight railroading. The trains are longer, the coupler forces are lower, the brakes respond faster, and the fuel bills are smaller. All because someone asked a simple question back in the early 1960s. What if the engine did not have to be at the front? The next time you're sitting at a crossing and you spot a lone diesel engine rolling through the middle of a long freight train, you'll know what it's doing there. That locomotive isn't out of place. It's the reason the rest of the train can exist at that length. Without it, the couplers would fail, the brakes would lag, and the curves would win. Everything else in that consist is built around it.